Nurses of psych wards, what did a patient do that left you speechless? This was actually in a state hospital that is part of the prison system for mentally ill offenders. Patient asked for Vaseline. Which is fine. They can have Vaseline, whatever. But this patient was given a whole tub, so of course he stripped completely naked, covered himself in Vaseline, and ran. It was a secure unit, and he didn't escape, but we couldn't get him back into his cell all shift because he was too effing slippery. No more tubs. Probably the saddest was a resident I had a long time ago. This gentleman was a World War II vet with Alzheimer's and dementia. Probably once or twice a month he would relive some battle he was in. He would literally run up the hallway and grab you and yell at you to get down behind the sandbags. He would then tell you to take his Thompson because it was too heavy for him and he would just use his pistol. Then, he would get up and run back down the hallway. This guy was old, and seeing him run full sprint like that up and down the hallway during one of his episodes was surreal. I can't imagine having to constantly relive the worst moments of your life where you witnessed and survived the unspeakable horrors of war. A nurse told me one of her patients killed himself on the unit while on one-to-one suicide watch. Edit, patient and staff were at arm's length and patient suddenly charged the wall, smashing his head as hard as he could, breaking his neck in the process. I watched a guy try to remove rats from his rectum. Stated that his ex-girlfriend summoned them there. He ended up tearing his rectal walls to shreds. Not a nurse, pharmacist. Had one of our clozapine patients miss a monthly meeting to discuss their medication. Called around, found out she was in the ICU having eaten 2 of her own fingers, then visited her mother for coffee, still bleeding. Had a friend tell me of another patient, made a cut in his thigh and reopened it regularly until the whole thing was a scar tissue cavern, by some miracle avoiding infection. Started using his meat pocket to hold pens and coins and anything he could collect in his ward. Nobody knew until a paperclip pierced the side and he finally wound up with an infection that took him to ICU where they found his stash. Not a nurse, but I used to be a security guard in a hospital, and we had a patient who self-harmed and cut a hole into themselves around their belly button, and then stuck a bunch of paper clips and buttons and things like that into it. We had a psych patient on our floor that wasn't really crazy, just really confused and unpleasant in general. One night I was mixing his drink with some thickener, and per usual he started yelling about me poisoning him. I explained what it was and that we're all here to help him, not hurt him, and he responds with, "I'm just going to die." His vitals were fine, he was alert, no red flags, and like I said, he was always pretty unpleasant, so I didn't think much of it. Sure as hell, he coded an hour later and we never got him back. My sister was actually sectioned earlier this year for her eating disorder. She shouldn't have been, but that's a story for another time, and she was right next to the PICU, Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit. One of the nights she heard multiple screams coming specifically from that ward. One of the patients had bit a chunk out of a nurse's leg as they were trying to detain them. They then started eating said chunk. It's crazy to think these types of things happen. We had a psychopathic rapist with reinforced delusions of grandeur. He was obsessed with a female nurse, convinced that she fancied him back, but her job prevented them from being together. When told that this wasn't the case, he thought that the male nurses fancied her and were jealous of him and the female nurses wanted him for themselves. He would try to seek her out alone, once tried to lure her to his room where he had a barricade waiting to block them in while he raped her. He admitted this, but insisted that it would have been consensual. That failed, so then he tried to get her fired instead with accusations. He bit himself and scratched his back, blaming her for them. The idea of that guy getting out still terrifies me. He has no remorse about any of his past crimes and basically thinks that the victims were lucky that he abused them. I visited a prison for a warden job and went to see the constant surveillance guys, for their own safety etc. There was a fella there who had used a razor to slice his stomach open and started pulling chunks of himself out for fun. He also started using the hole, which wouldn't heal, as a hiding place. A towel was found stuffed in there which his body had started fusing to. Apparently he was quite nice, but the whole thing wasn't for me and I didn't go ahead with applying. Not me, but my dad used to work in Airedale and J Ward, Australian Insane Asylum and Prison for the Criminally Insane, respectively, in the 70s. He used to talk about sunny days in J Ward where they'd bring out all the inmates during a sunny day and they'd promptly line up and start jacking off. In Airedale they deal with the jacking off problem by strapping you into cotton mittens, but a lot of the inmates would chew a hole through them just to get a finger out to jack off with. His worst story was about a psychotic woman in Airedale. She had self-inflicted scars all over her face from scratching herself, self-imposed bite marks all over her body from trying to eat herself, and she had the nasty habit of chewing the inside of her mouth and spitting blood at your eyes and mouth hoping you'd catch one of the myriad of diseases she carried. I'm an RN in Boston in a psych hospital and I've seen some crap. One of the things I'll never ever forget was, we had this manic guy that had been transferred from another unit because he kept getting in fights over there, and all the other patients were trying to attack him. I was still working nights back then and at about 3 a.m. he came up to me and said his tooth hurt and he needed to see a dentist right away. I said I don't have a dentist for him to see but when the doctor comes in the morning we can take a look. Gave him some Tylenol and sent him back to bed. About 5 minutes later he came out saying it really hurt and he needed to see a dentist to pull his tooth. Again, I told him there's no dentist but maybe I can get some more pain meds. In the middle of me explaining this to him he sticks his hand in his mouth and rips his molar out of his head and handed it to me. Blood starts pouring out of his mouth, but he did even to seem to notice. After I clean him up and get the bleeding to stop and call the doctor to get him some Ativan he goes. Make sure you give me that tooth back when I leave, that's my tooth, don't try and steal it. Effing wild stuff. I'm a tech at a psych hospital, but I start nursing school in August so I hope this counts. We had a very tall, heavy-set man who swung at a nurse and a fellow tech when they asked him to not stand naked in the door and flash the whole unit, so we put him in a hold and escorted him to the seclusion room. From there he tried to strangle himself with his underwear, he had them on his head like a bandana, so we opened the door and took those away. Then he peed all over the floor, did push-ups and every time he came down he would slurp it up. Eventually he got bored of that and began writing on the wall in his pee, and then masturbated onto the door and said it would be better if he could F my dead corpse. Eventually his MB52 kicked in and he contacted for safety/good behavior so we opened the door again, and he bit me on the hand and drew blood. From there I got permission to not be involved in the code and a peer swapped me out. Not me, but someone I knew was in a ward with a girl who wanted to be a vampire and drank blood from her own tampons. It's as atrocious as it sounds. She was around 16 and schizophrenic. Prison guard here. Guy cut his scrotum open to let people know he was serious, don't know about what. Guy 2. Cut off a butt cheek, or a big part of, and threw it at me as I tried to stop him. Guy 3. Punched a wall 3 times really hard, bloody knuckles, and told me he punched the devil cause he was telling him to stab me but I'm cool, so he told the devil to F off. Guy 4. Pretended to drown himself in a toilet, basically splashed pee on his face and rolled around crying. Guy 5. Had sex with a window air vent and was compliant, yet confused when I asked him to stop. Those were the days. Not a nurse but have had several stays on psychiatric wards for bipolar. To be fair, on most occasions, I didn't enter the wards in the most rational and stable state myself but what has tended to happen is that even when they bring you back down to earth, you can end up staying for an extra month or 2 before they let you go. So, I have spent some time on psychiatric wards completely sane if not maybe firing on all cylinders. Anyway, I have seen a few shocking things, like a guy cutting open his wrists with broken glass and bleeding out pretty severely, but to be honest, you quickly become desensitized. What tended to leave me speechless was the abruptness of certain behavior and its total incongruence with facial expressions etc. For example, sitting watching a TV when a 5-foot-tall 7-stone woman calmly walks over, suddenly lifts the TV up, and throws it into the wall with great force smashing it to bits, and then calmly sits back down in an armchair declaring that the TV was ruining her painting, she wasn't painting, by making the armchair give her an orgasm. She never even raised her voice. She then immediately asked me, as if it was somehow related, if I liked Lisa Stansfield. I was a CNA for about 4 years and the saddest ever was my client/resident constantly thought I was her daughter. She went to Harvard and was an extremely brilliant lady in her time. She was nonverbal but every time I walked into her room she would exclaim, "Elizabeth, you came." I loved this lady so much, She would only eat when I fed her. She was extremely combative with everyone but me. I ended up quitting my job there but visited her every single day. To the point that her family kind of accepted me as their family. I finally found out that Elizabeth took her own life at 21 and the fact that she thought I was her gave her extreme joy. I never corrected her, and I like to think I gave her peace when she passed holding my hand. She was an amazing lady and I miss her to this day. Not me, but a friend is a behavioral consultant for a psyche ward, and once told me a story about a patient that casually approached another patient, and proceeded to pin him against the wall and bite his eyelid off. I saw a crazy bipolar woman bring a man out of full catatonia with a blow job. This was years ago. Security wasn't as tight as these days. Somehow this extremely manic woman gets into this guy's room. Now the guy, let's call him Gary has been full catatonic since we got him, couldn't care for himself at all, he would just stare all day long. Well, I guess she must have sucked the depression right out of the guy, because he was right as rain afterward. We found them at the end of the session. Probably gave his brain the serotonin and dopamine dump it needed to snap out. That's my guess. Never saw him again. A student, I was studying and this guy began to freak out and carved out his intestines with bare hands. Never thought it was possible but considering him being a former powerlifter maybe it's possible. Guy was like 6'6" and has to be kept under constant supervision as he'd once tried to kill the compounder with food plates then he was only given a paper plate and edible crockery. Not a nurse but a former patient, on many occasions, who helped out since I am surprisingly stable even if very weird and uncanny at times. And this one time a co-patient apparently came in with so many fleas, it's amazing. Turns out he didn't wash his hair for the last few months. So besides being oily and heck it was also full of fleas. When asked for why he didn't wash the hair he reasoned that he didn't want to drown the fleas. I mean it is solid reasoning but kinda stupid. Because you don't want to have fleas. My ex's mum used to work at Broadmoor Hospital for years. For those unaware, Broadmoor is a very famous asylum for the criminally insane in the UK. She said the strangest thing is how normal the patients were because of all the meds they were on. They're like children eager to please. She met Peter Sutcliffe aka the Yorkshire Ripper numerous times and just said he was nice to everyone, although he was attacked a few times. Her scariest moment for sure though involved this huge fat black guy who'd killed animals, and eventually a person by sitting on their chests whilst he'd try his best to watch their faces as they died. Anyway, he was very nice and helpful to everyone and eventually my ex's mum let her guard down around him. He came with her to get something. And as they went into a room he closed the door behind him and just stood there. My ex's mum pressed her panic button that all staff kept with them, and then used her training to try and keep him calm and stall for security, but it was no luck as he attacked her. Luckily for her though, as part of her training at Broadmoor also included some self-defense techniques that even the most smallest woman could employ. Basically, she used her finger knuckles to press into the sides of his ribs and he let go of her long enough for her to escape. She did it to me once and I'll side with the crazy fat black guy on this, it's incredibly painful. My aunt was a pharmacist in a psych hospital in Iraq. She told me that a family brought their son in. He was previously detained and tortured by Saddam's security. The young man was admitted as a severe case. He then started to hold imaginary trials and sentence people to death by hanging. One day they did find another patient hanged, dead, and the young man was standing next to him shouting. Justice was served. Not a nurse, but I worked in a group home for teens and one ended up in a psych ward. She was a sweet 15-year-old girl who had been there for about 3 weeks. Plans for the future, would be staying with a relative she liked in a week, had friends, and had no history of issues whatsoever, aside from her mom kicking her out of the house for having a boyfriend, which she was understandably upset about. She went from sane to broken overnight. It was about 1 a.m. when I found her awake during checks, sitting on her bed and looking upset. She had become convinced she was pregnant, in spite of tests saying otherwise. Then the baby had been changed by chemicals. She was terrified of the baby inside her, and the chemicals everywhere, changing everything. We couldn't seem to get her to realize she wasn't pregnant, couldn't be pregnant. And she would go on rants about chemicals but it's hard to exactly what she was talking about. Cleaners? Pollution? Medication, which she wasn't on. She talked about chemicals getting in things, The way some people talk about the devil. All strange, but still just borderline alarming. Then the clock started talking to her and telling her what to do, some of which involved burning herself and knocking her head against the wall. This is when we called authorities. She then basically became incoherent, in a word salad way, and was unresponsive to us, even when we got between her and the wall she was thumping. It was like we weren't there to her. When she was hauled away, about 4 hours after initial weird statements about how she was suddenly pregnant, she was in a kind of manic but also oddly passive state, again like we weren't there, and was unable to walk. She had to be carried out on a stretcher. She was mentally somewhere else entirely. It was terrifying watching herself collapse so quickly and completely. Sometimes you give baby dolls to dementia patients because it gives them an activity. Caring for and rocking a baby doll can have a calming effect and improve mood. I once had a patient in the later stages of vascular dementia, who was very agitated. When not much else was working, we gave her a baby doll. She calmed down and started rocking the doll, and I went back to charting. Then I heard her start crying. I went around the desk to try and comfort her. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but patients just cry sometimes. When I sat down next to her, she said, "I know this baby ain't real." Then she began sobbing inconsolably. I put my arm around her and let her cry. I just sat there with her, silently letting her cry. Not my favorite mental health story, but it was a literal time that a patient left me speechless.